Prevent trouble before it arises. Put things in order before they exist. The giant pine tree grows from a tiny sprout. The journey of 1,000 miles starts from beneath your feet. Lao Tzu. Welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. This is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but have the confidence to rock retirement. Dare I change a little bit of this quote? And the journey of rocking retirement starts from beneath your feet. From the little baby step you take from now to the next step and the next step. Good wisdom from a historic figure. All right, and we have some good wisdom to share as we finish up this month-long series on functional health with Dr. Bobby DuBois. Good guy. This is a series that is, to me anyway, one of the most important ones we ever done. And one of the ones I didn't think about. I didn't think about health as functional health, only if by him finding me at our roundup last year and being so passionate about it, did this arise. I love to see how these things come about. So I want to thank Bobby for sharing his wisdom and always bringing it back to the important things. Today, we're going to talk about a really big topic. How do we navigate all of this stuff? How do we know what to believe and what not to believe? It's harder than you think in health. And I was telling Bobby earlier, it's harder than you think in rocking retirement and planning your retirement. That's one of the biggest obstacles actually for you on your journey from the financial aspect of it is knowing what to believe and what to do, because there's so many voices telling you their interpretation of the opinion and their fact set, and navigating all of that and simplifying it so you don't get overwhelmed is a challenge, just like with health. That's a lot of what my mission is to operationalize this to help give you framework. So hopefully I am accomplishing that at some level for you and in turn for me. All right, with that, let's get on with the show. This show is sponsored by LTCI Partners, an independent insurance agency that focuses on helping people make sense of how to manage long-term care risk. And they have the heart of a teacher. And I suggest you go to ltcipartners.com/RAM. And a great first step is to just click on Get Quotes. And what that will do is it'll take you to a form to do a pre-screen questionnaire to see if you're likely even to qualify for long-term care insurance. And assuming you are, they'll send you some sample quotes of policies without a lot of sales follow-up, unless you choose to interact with them. And this, at a minimum, is going to give you data of one, am I likely to get qualified based on my health and medical history? And two, I want to look at a quote and see what it looks like and just start to understand it. So it's a great way to collect data. And if you choose to pursue it, I think they are a great option to help you make sense of a pretty complicated topic. So ltcipartners.com/RAM. With that, let's get on to chatting with Bobby about functional health. So I'm a little bit sad because this is the last series of this episode with you, Bobby, on functional health. I'm sad because it's so important in the emails that we've gotten, and I've shared a few with you, Bobby, that this is an important topic. And two, because you explain this stuff really well. We walk through this in a very approachable way. So I thank you for that.
My pleasure. Thank you. Very kind words.
Now we're going to talk about how to approach health problems, right? We talked about what is functional health in the first episode, and then exercise, and then nutrition. Now we're getting down to there's some health issues that come up when we age. Things break and things need to be addressed, and how we address them makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Well, it really does. And we don't live forever, and we don't have replacement body parts quite yet. So each of us will face medical problems, and how to approach those problems conceptually, and then how to work with your doctor to get you what you need is a really critical phase for you, your loved ones, and anyone else that you deal with. So it's an important topic.
And if we call the goal here is to be able to embrace life physically for as long as possible during the aging process. That's the goal.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, you created a great framework to go through health related issues, which honestly, because you send me outlines, which are amazing, which I wish I would have had beforehand, because the old way of looking at our interactions with doctors in the medical industry is they know everything. I don't know anything. I do what they say. That godlike version of the doctor, which is, from a historical standpoint. And I think that's changed a lot. I know it has with me, but also who your doctor is a little bit less clear than it used to be, right? That family practitioner that has known your entire family for decades is a little bit different with the advent of HMOs and so forth. So you might not have that relationship with a doctor to begin with. Before we get into the outline, how do we navigate that part of it in that we don't have this relational currency potentially with the person that we're interacting with?
Well, the world has changed, and we can move back to an environment where you have a doctor that you can call your own doctor. As you mentioned, 20 years ago, people had their primary care doctor and they took care of many, many things. Things evolved and everybody was wanting to see the cardiologist, the dermatologist, the specialist. And the problem is that the primary care doctor just became the go-to person to get referrals. And too often, the primary care doctor wasn't the quarterback, didn't really know what happened at the cardiology. They would get a summary note, but they wouldn't really understand. And the oncologist certainly took care of things and didn't necessarily get tightly back to the primary care doctor. And we've gone along with that evolution, we, the patient, and we, the doctor. But I think there's now a movement back to having one person that you can depend upon. When I moved to Austin, I had to find a doctor for the first time. Oh my gosh. And I had a way of going about it, which may or may not be available to everybody, but I found an extraordinary primary care doctor, a general internist. And although he is the quarterback and sends me to people, he's very, very much on top of things. And if something goes wrong, I know where to go and he understands my whole history. Now, that may be available, that model may be available to you. It may not be. There is also the concierge model where you pay a doctor $1,000 a year, $2,000 a year, or whatever the number is. And that allows the doctor not to have too many patients in his practice. So you can email him. You can have telehealth visits. They will always be available. At some level, there are concierge practices, which cost a lot more. They will go with you to the cardiologist and be your ombudsman with. So you can build that back in. And that's something I think people should be proactive about.
Yeah, I think that's an emerging, it's an emerging industry, isn't it? I've seen those examples. I've not used one, but it's something that's coming up, I guess, maybe from some of these issues.
It is. And for the first time in my life, I'm paying health insurance premiums because my employer always did it. And now I'm on Medicare and I'm paying $1,000 for my Part B, another $500 a month. This is all per month for wraparound stuff and drug coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm probably putting in $15,000, $20,000 a year. And people were like, well, I'm not paying $1,000 or $2,000 to a concierge doctor. Well, I think that's crazy because you're already putting in $1,000 a month. What's $1,000 extra a year to have the person you can turn to when issues arise? So I'm not selling concierge practices, but I think if you can't find a doctor that you really can depend upon and handle much of what you need, I would look into this direction.
Yeah, definitely. If you have the means, I guess there's a good corollary to if you, a generalist financial planner or retirement planner versus an investment manager, an insurance expert, etc.
Exactly.
There's not that QB and everybody has their biases and their specialty and that's what they want to do. And I think that gets through. So I appreciate that perspective because it wasn't on the outline. I sort of popped that on you. So let's talk about a high level framework when we have something that we're trying to deal with.
So you may have a small problem. Well, I think I got a bunion or gosh, this nagging back has been hurting me. or I look like I have some cardiac problem or cancer, whatever it is. Ideally, you'll have a framework for to say, how do I go about thinking through whatever the problem is, small, medium, or large? At the 60,000 foot level, the framework really is, I need to make sure that I get the right diagnosis, which then leads to the right treatment. And if you have to have a procedure related to that, a GI endoscopy, surgery, then the right provider matters, because not everybody does the surgery as well as you would like them to. But for most of what we're talking about, it's making sure you get the right diagnosis and the right treatment. Now, we'll go through how do you reassure yourself that you are getting the right diagnosis and the right treatment, and you're going to the right doctor.
That is good, because that's where I was going to go. That's
where we begin.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, because the diagnosis is most things are not black and white, right?
Well, they're not black and white, which is really important to understand. People think, oh, I have an ear infection. They're going to look in my ear and they're going to know it's an ear infection. And that's the diagnosis, which leads to treatment and so on and so forth. Even that is more complicated. Well, is it an infection in the middle ear? Is it in the outer ear? Sometimes it's a little hard to tell. The treatments are completely different. So it's not always straightforward. You were talking about the era in the past where your doctor was God. That was sort of the joke at the time, and people had coffee mugs that said something related to that, or shirts or whatever. It was a very paternalistic view. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. Doctor, I'm sick. I'm scared. I can't think straight about what you've just told me. What should I do? Now, this is all predicated on the assumption that your doctor always suggests the right thing. Now, I don't want to build mistrust between you and your doctor, but it is more complicated than my doctor said this, therefore it is right. And I wanted to share with people some 3 different reasons why you need to be an active consumer and participate in getting to the right diagnosis and the right treatment. So the first issue is doctors all want to do the right thing. They want to do evidence-based medicine. They want to do what's going to get you feeling as good as possible. That's why we went into medicine, and we're certainly not trying to do anything to circumvent that. So how is it that you might not get the right thing? Well, the first is a lot of stuff that we do as doctors with our patients hasn't really been tested. I do it because my mentor told me, and my colleague down the hall does it. Things as simple as, should you have an annual visit and get a regular EKG or a treadmill test? That really hasn't been adequately studied. It's become tradition. But when it's been looked at, it's not really clear that it really helps you beyond when you begin to get symptoms. And there are certain things, of course, you want to screen for. So that's the first thing. A lot of what we do, I can't go to a scientific study and say, yes, you should do it this way. The second is, and we talked about this last time, what we think is true may not turn out to be true. You know, the bloodletting from hundreds of years ago, to the hormone treatment for women in menopause, which we thought was good, and then it wasn't good. And we're living through this again. There's just reports on the news that, maybe we were asking people to socially distance and wear masks when the evidence really wasn't as firm as it should be. And remember, ivermectin and zinc and Zithromax, they were all, this is what you should do. So sometimes people think what's right is right, and then it turns out it's not. And the third thing, and I think people don't really understand this one, the average patient, is that probably 1 in 3 things that we do with our patients actually is unnecessary. You go to the doctor with a respiratory infection, you get antibiotics. Most often it's a virus that's probably not going to help you. And it may or may not hurt you. You have some back pain, you go to the doctor and you say, well, I think I should get an MRI, and the doctor wants to make you happy. You get the MRI scan, which is completely unnecessary for the vast majority of people. But once you've done the MRI scan, then it shows something. Well, you got a bulging disc here, and that leads you down the path of potentially unnecessary surgery.
Bobby, that actually was my journey in January. I'm calling it a pinched nerve in my neck. I don't know what it was. And it shot down my arm, and it was extreme pain. And I went to the doctor. He couldn't diagnose it per se because you're just feeling around. You can't really tell because it's all internal. And I think he gave me some anti-inflammatories, rested and so forth. And I actually called in at a moment of weakness, of severe pain, maybe a week or two later, and said, I need an MRI. And they prescribed it to me. And then I thought better because I was really trying not to go that route. And I ended up never actually going get the MRI. But I'm guessing that from their point of view, I'm in severe pain. It's better to get it. They want to help me feel better. So I can see how this can go. And the reason I really wanted to avoid the MRI was I knew if I got the MRI, it would likely lead me to a specialist, which would lead me to something else. And I wanted to try to avoid that decision tree going down. But I'm guessing they probably prescribed it to me because I was in pain and they wanted to help me. And that's a natural human reaction, right?
It's a natural human reaction. And my point here is not to say don't trust your doctor. My point here is to say that for one reason or another, the evidence is not there. The evidence later changes. There are things that we prescribe or do with our patients that may or may not be fully supported by science. And it's just important to have a healthy skepticism. And we will get to some of the questions that will help you ferret out whether, in fact, it is the right thing.
I would think a part of that also, I agree with that. And just seeing, dealing with doctors through my mother's cancer and my sister's cancer and other things, that's part of the wisdom of being proactive and engaged in it and not just listening to what they say is just a healthy kind of way to approach it. But I wanted to ask, and I also think that we have to check ourselves in our desire to have it fixed now, because usually we're going to the doctor because there's something that we want to be addressed, and we have to be careful that we're not, I don't want to say overly stating it. How do I want to say it? We don't want to put pressure on the doctor to just fix it now, I guess is the easiest way to say it, because they want to, and they might lead them to the path of an MRI or whatever.
I think that can be absolutely true.
No different than right now, I think, with the markets of we're about in a bear market, maybe already are at the time of this chat. And it's very easy for a patient, a client, this really sucks, fix it now, right? Where fixing it now might not be the best thing to do. So it's a human dance, I guess.
Well, and I think that financial scenario is very real. And I think sort of leads us to, I think, what the next topic is, which is, okay, so now I have this healthy skepticism. I'll think carefully about what my doctor is recommending. But now how do we get to the right diagnosis and the right treatment? I'm a very framework-oriented person, so we talked about the high-level fragment. Let's get the right diagnosis and then the right treatment. But then underneath that, there's another level of questions to ask that will work for whether it's a big illness, a medium illness, or a small one. And it really is analogous to what's going on today with inflation. You need a framework. Well, if I went to my financial advisor, I wouldn't want him just to say, well, there, Bobby, it'll be fine.
Right.
There would be a systematic approach. Well, how long do we think this inflation is going to last? How severe do we think it is? How resilient is my portfolio? And if it is a problem, how much will it affect my retirement spending? And then what can I do about it? I mean, you would want them to go through and challenge them. Like, do these last episodes of inflation last a year or 22 years? What's typical? How bad is it? Does it usually start bad and then get worse, start bad and get a little bit better? That would help me feel comfortable that, I'm doing what I can do on my portfolio. So similarly, if you're being faced with a medical issue, you need to figure out, how am I going to sort through my options? First, by myself looking at information and then talking about it with my doctor. So I've divided it into a number of questions. And let's say your doctor says you've got this problem and we think you should do X. Now, X could be a medication, X could be a scan you're going to do, X could be a surgical procedure. And the questions really apply to whatever the thing is that's being recommended. So the first thing is, now, why do I need this? And what would I do with this? So the scan of your neck, the only reason to do it is that there's something that would come after that would show up on the scan. So why do I need it? The second is, what happens if I don't do it? Your doctor recommended the scan of your neck, but then you said, I think not. Now, if your doctor said, well, look, you could have cancer in your neck. If you don't do it, this could be a big problem. Right. So you want to understand, why am I doing this? And what happens if I don't? Third, are there alternatives? In your case, well, why don't we just send you to physical therapy? Because regardless of the scan, we're probably going to want physical therapy. So what are the alternatives? Now, what are the risks associated with this? When you take medications, people say, well, yes, there are side effects and I need to understand those, but everything has a risk. The scan has a risk because it might find something that actually isn't something you should operate on, but then you go down to this cascade. Next, what's the cost of it? So you want to understand the cost, not the cost to the hospital, but what you're going to have to pay for it. And then ultimately, what are the costs of the alternatives? So it's a systematic way. And maybe in the show notes or whatever, we could list these questions so people might have them. But basically, you want to know, why do I need this? What happens if I don't do it? What are the alternatives? What are the risks of doing it? And what are the costs of doing it and the alternative? And we're going to go through a case study later. So I hope some of this, which seems a bit ethereal, can come down to earth and people are like, oh, now I understand how these questions work.
This is a lot of how we try to do the themes on the show, is just think through it in an organized way. And one thing I like about this framework, and we'll definitely have to make a worksheet out of this, is that you may not get crystal clear answers to each one of these, but the process, the exercise of doing it is going to be very valuable. And
absolutely
from empowering you.
And if there's uncertainties, you want to know them and just put that into the equation of how you think about it.
I would also think that in this world of the internet and the WebMD effect of having access to so much is you can use all these amazing resources that are free in an organized way rather than cascading through all the things that you might have or you might have to go through. That can be debilitating mentally rather than going through all this information in an organized way so you can make sense of all the stuff you can read on the internet a little bit better.
Right. And so step one is, let's put a framework together for how to ask these questions. Step two is, okay, let's get the evidence. I'm very much about the evidence. A good theory, as we talked about in the nutrition space, is not evidence. If your doctor said, oh, well, you have inflammation in your neck, and I did a blood test and your inflammation markers are elevated, I think you should cut out gluten from your diet, take these herbal treatments because they will calm the inflammation down. Again, we talked about the various pills that you get that are advertised on TV and the such. That may be great theory, but is there really evidence that those things work? And just because your doctor says it with such strength doesn't necessarily mean there's evidence. So step one is to realize a good theory is not evidence. As we talked about last time in the nutrition space, some evidence and studies are stronger than others. Observational studies, when you look at a group of people that did something and you compared them to a group of people who didn't, is fraught with all sorts of what are called confounders. We talked through a few examples last week. People looked at towns around the world that wore masks and compared them to towns around the world in COVID that didn't wear masks and made certain pronouncements. But there's a lot about different towns in France versus Bangladesh that go beyond whether they just wore masks or not. And so if it's just an observational study, you got to have a little bit of skepticism. The randomized trials we talked about, where you take a group of people and you randomly allocate them, you're going to get this treatment, you're going to get something else, and compare them. That's the gold standard. And as often as possible, we want that to be supporting what we do. Okay, so now you want to look for evidence. And of course, you're going to Google bunion treatment or neck shooting pain or whatever it is. The problem is you're going to be overwhelmed with information. And you then have to say, well, which stuff do I believe and which stuff do I don't believe? I would say a place to begin is one of the curated sites. So Harvard has a site, the Mayo Clinic has the site, WebMD has a site. I think that's a reasonable place to begin because these have been curated by somebody, as opposed to Dr. Jones wrote an article and it's on the web that says this thing will solve your problem.
And click here to sign up for my email list with a special offer.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So curated sites are good. But again, while you're looking at the curated sites, ask yourself the question, even the Harvard newsletter or whatever is going to make a recommendation. Ask yourself, well, what's the evidence that supports that? They should have references. You could click on them. And, if it looks like it was a big, large study done in lots of people and randomized, well, okay, that's something I can believe in more.
Can I ask you a question about this?
Go ahead.
When it comes to an evidence-based study rather than an observational study, that bar is so much higher. How much is actually out there that meets that standard for most medical problems? Is it the rare bird because the bar is so high? Or is 90% of what we're reading really more observational studies rather than these gold standard? I mean, how much of it is actually out there relative to all the claims that are observational?
That is a fabulous foundational question. If you do a summary of the literature on a different topic, vast majority of studies will be observational in nature. We did this bunion treatment in a series of 100 patients. And this is where they were before, and this is where they were after. That's very, very common. That's not a randomized trial. Now, on the other end of the spectrum are medications. Any medication that is approved by the FDA has to have had a rigorous randomized controlled trial. The caveat there is, for the reason the drug was approved, it has to have gone through that sort of rigor. So if somebody had rheumatoid arthritis, many of the drugs that are prescribed were tested specifically in those patients. But once the drug is on the market, it can be used for all sorts of other uses, which may or may not have been tested in patients in that same rigorous fashion.
Ivermectin would be an example of that.
Absolutely.
Right.
And when they finally got around to doing randomized controlled trials, ivermectin did not help COVID. And there's still plenty of people who say, oh, yes, it does. It was just wrong dose, wrong timing, whatever. So most of what's out there is probably of observational, lower quality. Now, it's not to say there's no such thing as a rigorous observational study. There are. It's hard to do, and the easy ones to do are not as well done.
So we have this framework, and I think you have an example, but let's talk about a structure when you're actually dealing with the doctor. You've done some research, you have your questions ready. How do you actually interact with the doctor as you go through this? And, we could use me as a pinched nerve guy going in or whatever, but how do we actually go through this to have this good interaction with our doctor?
Yes, let's dive in. The worst scenario is the doctor does some test for another reason, and you walk in the door and he says, I have bad news, you have cancer. At that point, you shut down emotionally. You can't think. There's not a good time to have a dialogue. But for most things, it's either a chronic illness that isn't being handled as well as you'd like. I have COPD or asthma or bad allergies, and I'm just not getting where I need to, where you have time to reflect, to think, to read on the web, frame your thoughts, and have a discussion with your doctor. So that's the more typical. And if somebody says you have cancer, usually if it's a good doctor, they'll say, why don't you go home, talk to your spouse, let's come back and have a deeper conversation, because everybody knows once they've said something like that, you can't think. So I want to empower you as a patient that you have every right to sit down with your doctor and ask questions and expect to get answers. Now, if your doctor doesn't play by the same rule book, time to find a new doctor. And certainly the concierge doctor, you're paying them for that extra time. Now, with that said, you cannot at the end of your visit say, oh, by the way, doctor, I have these 42 questions to ask you. The doctors are on a very tight schedule. So what I recommend is boil it down to a small number of questions, 2, 3, 4 questions, and then give your doctor the heads up that the questions are coming. A lot of practices now offer you a patient portal. You can send an email to your doctor. Certainly with COVID and telemedicine, that was very popular. Give a heads up that I would like to talk about these 3 questions at our next visit. Now, if you don't have a portal, when you go into the office, the nurse at some point is going to weigh you and take your blood pressure. Give that piece of paper typed, easy to read, to the nurse. And they will give it to the doctor before the doctor walks in the door. So there is a heads up. Understand that the doctor may not have time to answer all those questions. And it's very reasonable to say, could I set up another visit where we just spend 15 minutes or so talking through it? So be proactive, but be respectful that unfortunately our doctors are not paid handsomely to sit and talk. They have to see a lot of patients. But there are workarounds so that you can ask the questions.
This is, I think, critical because it's very intimidating for a lot of us to ask questions to the doctor. One, because we don't have a framework to begin with. We don't know what to ask. And so having the framework, and I think this structure, like a good example is when we set up huddles with clients, one of the questions we ask in setting up that huddle is, what things do you want to talk about when we meet? Because as the provider in this case, not the doctor, obviously, it helps because you can have context and you may not be able to answer the question, but you can be prepared to address it and to begin the process of answering it rather than just having it spurred on you and having the context shift. So I think it is a very valuable thing to let them know what you're concerned about beforehand. I love that.
I think what you do with your financial practice is exactly what I'm suggesting that you do here. Shall we go to a case study as a way to maybe bring this home as to how you would go about it?
Always. Let's do it.
This is a real case study. This is a friend of mine. She's in her 50s. And this happened a week ago, or I should say, it's in evolution. The issue just arose. And so I sat down with her and said, okay, let's think about this in a logical way. And what I'm going to walk you through really is you could apply it to any medical problem, but this just happens to be one that happened last week. So this friend is generally feeling fine, but she ended up with a lung scan for some reason or other. I don't even actually know why she ended up with a lung scan. And on the lung scan, they said, there's something funny at the bottom of your lungs that looks like maybe it's actually part of your liver. So she ended up with a liver scan. And they found a mass on the liver scan. And it's about the size of an orange. So it's not like a marble.
You would think you knew you had an orange in you. That's crazy.
A liver is a pretty big thing and it doesn't have pain receptors. So it's actually not a surprise.
Okay.
Now, on the scan, they said, well, it looks like a hemangioma. Now, hemangioma is not a cancer, but it is a tumor. There's lots of tumors that grow, but they're not cancerous, which means they're not going to metastasize. They're just going to grow. But a hemangioma is made out of lots of blood vessels. And so that mass could rupture. And if it ruptures, there's a lot of bleeding, and that bleeding could be serious. So now one of the adages in medicine is you can't make an asymptomatic patient feel better. They already feel fine. You can only make them feel worse. So now this person has an orange-sized thing in their liver. And now how do you even begin to think about it? So let's sort of take the next steps here.
And I think that point is really important, but I feel perfectly fine. That's a really interesting, they already feel fine. So you're talking almost about something theoretical to them.
Well, yes. And that's one of the challenges of diabetes and hypertension is we can't get our patients to take medicine because they feel fine, even though they're a ticking time bomb. But now you've got this mass in your liver. Is it a ticking time bomb? So how do we think about it? So remember I said, why do I need X? And, what are the risks if I don't do it? So let's begin with that. So the problem is that not just that you got this lump, but that it could rupture and bleed. And so the question is, what's the risk of it rupturing? Am I going to spend the next 30 years of my life and nothing's going to happen? Is it a 1 in 10 chance it's going to rupture? 1 in 100? 1 in 1,000? We need some magnitude here to help us understand the risks.
On this risk, specific to this case, we have intuitive and wisdom-based calculations of probabilities. Is there a evidence-based way of getting to what are the odds of it rupturing?
Well, let's come back to that
Okay.
thorny question as I go through all of this.
Okay.
And this is, as I say, where the rubber meets the road. So if it does rupture, how serious is it? Well, yeah, you might be sick for a day or two, or you're going to be rushed to the hospital and there's a 1 in 10 chance you're dying if it ruptures. So what are those complications? What's the risk of it? Because
the
remember,
severity of the risk. What's the severity of the risk? Okay.
Because one of the things in my framework is what happens if I don't do X? And let's just say here's X is, let's go in and yank the darn thing out. So now we're trying to understand what happens if I don't. Now, do I have any agency over whether it ruptures? Well, if you're a parachutist and you land on the ground, that's a riskier thing than if you're just you enjoy pickleball. So are there any things that might make me at higher risk or not? And then basically you multiply the first times the third, which is what's the likelihood it's going to rupture? And then if it does rupture, how bad would that be? And then you get some sense of, if I do nothing, what risk am I running? Now you then say on the other side of the coin, well, if I went to have it removed, how big an operation is it? And am I going to be laid up for a week, a month, 6 months? Is there a risk of dying for being in surgery? And what does that look like? So you basically are saying, why might I consider surgery? What are the risks of that? And what happens if I don't do anything? What are the risks? And trying to put some numbers around it. Now, and of course, you get asked about the cost and the cost of the alternative, which is doing nothing, which is free. So all the standard framework actually does work. But now you've asked the thorny question, how do I fill in the numbers? And what you need to realize is that not everybody's the same. Even if I could find some of these numbers, they may be in 30-year-olds in Sweden, and I'm 60 years old. Maybe the numbers apply, maybe they don't apply. Maybe the numbers we have are on ones that are golf ball size and mine's orange size, or vice versa.
Or maybe we just don't know. Nobody actually knows.
There are probably not enough of these that have been studied in a way that you would be able to answer. So a lot of this will be, we don't know. Now, my friend got told, I think we'll probably want to do nothing. And she's going back in a week and armed with the questions I've asked. It'll be interesting to see what she finally decides. But what happens more often than not is that the doctor is really going to be just using his or her best judgment. They don't have time to do all of the research to say, is there evidence out there and how rigorous is the evidence? They're going to use their general understanding and apply it to your case, which then brings me to that question I asked earlier on, the thorny one of, you want to go to the right person to do the right surgery. And one question, I love second opinions. I think second opinions are something that are very important to do. And one way of deciding for yourself whether you need one is say to the doctor, this is a gentle way to say it. Everybody's worried if I ask for a second opinion, they'll hate me forever. Doctor, how often do you see this hemangioma problem?
That's a much better way of asking to get information. I think that's a good question.
And if they say, well, I see it a few times a year, that's really different than, well, it happens occasionally. The more you get a sense that they've thought about this a lot, the less you need to go see a specialist. Because there are specialists in liver, there are specialists that probably focus on this thing. And even those people may not know the risk of surgery. You might have to talk to the surgeon to say some of that. So I'm very big on, if there's anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, then you might want to get a second opinion and reassure yourself one way or the other.
I'm thinking through this framework. A lot of this applies so much to what I do in terms, I like the framework. And you're not going to have a crystal clear answer, but you're going to have a much better foundation for making your own judgments.
I think that's right.
And that's so far better than not being organized.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to feel comfortable. I knew this, but it was driven home in Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets of you can do everything right, but ultimately it's just an educated guess. And the key is to make educated guesses or judgments in an organized way and not in a disorganized way. Your odds of having more consistent, better decisions is a lot better. That's a lot of betters, but I think it makes sense.
Makes sense to me.
So let's sum this up. You want to approach medical problems in a systematic way, just like your financial portfolio. There's so many things with retirement planning, and because there's diagnosis, treatment, how often they see, all this stuff really does apply, the same structure. And I think you actually pointed that out to me when we first met, is the key is organized decision-making, because we're dealing with very fluid human bodies and not simply a spreadsheet. medicine's not as black as white as some think it is. And I think that's important to understand. So let's sum this up from a serious standpoint, Dr. DuBois. Being functionally healthy, this is part of that. How would you summarize what we need to be doing in being functionally healthy? Obviously, it's physical, it's nutrition, and it's dealing with medical issues.
Well, at the very beginning, we talked about the three-legged stool of retirement, and rocking retirement requires us to have our financial house in order. A sense of purpose in what I'm doing actually makes me happy and will continue to make me happy. And then the last is the health to be able to permit me to live that retirement era as I would like it to. And so this third leg of the stool, we then sort of exploded out to saying, if I want to be as functional and healthy as I can, knowing that I will die eventually, what can I do? And the first is to be proactive and think about that. I mean, there are people on your podcast that you've talked to and in the club, but they check their stock portfolio 3 times a day and they're like always monitoring it. Well, I'm not saying you should check your health 3 times a day, but you want to be monitoring it and proactive about it. So that's really the first piece of the puzzle. And then it's like, well, what do I have agency? What can I control? Well, one thing is exercise. Exercise is a critically important thing, not only to live longer, but to keep your body being able to do what you want to do and think ahead, because your strength today is going to fall. So you really, really want to get ahead of the game on this. And the second piece of the puzzle of this after the exercise is you have control over your nutrition and take an active role in that. I mean, there are reasons to eat or not eat that will help you live longer. And we talked a bit about that. And probably the most important is to be at a reasonable weight, because that leads to a cascade of problems if you don't. And that's where I would spend a lot of time. And how to do that? There's no magic diet. I wish there was. It's basically eating generally healthy and not so many processed foods and eating the right amounts and such. And then when something goes wrong, because it inevitably will medically, have a systematic way to think about it, approach your doctor, work with your doctor, work with the healthcare system in a way that you can get your questions answered and make the best decisions that will give you a chance to rock retirement for another 10, 20, or 30 years. So I think those are the take-home messages I hope people have learned.
Hope. I use the word hope. And as you were talking through these frameworks, hope is like my favorite word, because hope means you have to have 3 things. You have to have an inspiring goal, a vision of a better future for yourself. But then you have to have agency, the belief that you can act in some way to work towards that goal. And you created frameworks for agency. And then you have to have pathways to apply that agency to get to that future state. And all the frameworks that you've given us meet all of those 3 things. So I appreciate your wisdom, and no doubt we will be chatting with you again on the show. And I know we're going to be doing things in the club. So I appreciate that.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right, let's get to answering some of your questions about how to rock retirement. Working through these questions, we have a huge hopper. But if you do have a question, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger, and we'll do our best to answer it on the show. So let me see who we got first. And our first question is from Ron regarding how we characterize a home equity, the value of a home in our planning. So let's get to Ron's question.
Good morning, Roger. I really enjoyed your podcast this week. Over the years that I've listened, you frequently refer to home ownership as an asset, but as a use asset, not really to be included in your net worth statement. I think I disagree on that point. If you take, for example, the $300,000 that one might have in equity in their house that they own outright, if they didn't own the house, they would have to pay rent. So the same $300,000 invested in an annuity, for example, might produce a certain amount of income that could be used toward rent. One of the big differences is that it would be an annuity that continued to increase in value because rent goes up, and the rent equivalent that you're not paying by owning your house essentially increases as well. So from my perspective, it seems like home ownership really is a financial asset. I'd love to get your opinion on this idea.
Hey, Ron, I appreciate your perspective. And I think we actually agree with each other on the treatment of a home on our balance sheet. So first off, I do think a home should be listed on a net worth statement. So a net worth statement is a list of all of our assets on the left column and a list of all of our liabilities on the right column. And then you total up the assets, total up the liabilities, subtract the liabilities from the assets, and that's your net worth. So like if I look at my net worth statement, I have the home listed as a asset on my net worth statement. And then now I have a mortgage. So I have the mortgage listed on the liability side. It is a use asset in the sense that it's something that we're using, but you make to live, right? So we don't have to rent someplace. But you do make a very good point, is that there is an opportunity cost to that, right? If you didn't own the house and you rented, you would have this financial money that you could invest that potentially could throw off income. But then now you would introduce a rent payment. So it would change the dynamic of a net worth statement. And I think where I make the distinction on this, Ron, is on a net worth statement, you do want to list all of your assets, some of them use assets, some of them not, and all of your liabilities. Now, on the household balance sheet, which is a different kind of balance sheet and one that we help people create in the Rock Retirement Club, and we've talked about it on the show, we look at finances a little bit differently on a household balance sheet. And I think this is where your point is going to be incorporated much more, Ron. So I don't know if you've created one of these or seen one of these, in that when we're looking in a household balance sheet, you're going to have three sources of capital. You're going to have, or assets. You're going to have social capital, which is Social Security and pensions. And on a household balance sheet, we would calculate the net present value of the income flow of that Social Security payment, as an example, and show it as one value on the household balance sheet. Let's say it's $1.5 million is the net present value of all those cash flows with inflation, using a reasonable discount rate. And then with human capital, we would do the same thing. And then the financial capital would not include the house because you own the house. So it's not going to produce anything for you. And then on the liability side of a household balance sheet, we would have the normal debts, whatever we owe from a debt standpoint, but we also would have the net present value of consumption listed as a liability on the right-hand column of a household balance sheet. So as an example that you point out here, Ron, is one item might be rental payments that will go up in inflation. If you didn't have a house and you had rental payments, then we would have a value of the net present value of the inflation-adjusted cash flows of the rental payments as one value on the liability side, because that's something that you would have to provide for. Just like if you decided you wanted to travel and spend $10,000 a year on travel over 20 years, that would show as one item called travel. It would have a net present value of whatever that liability looked like on the household balance sheet. So we would incorporate it there. And on the household balance sheet, to extend this a little bit, Ron, is if you chose, let's say you owned a house, so you didn't have that rental issue. Let's say you owned $1 million house and you chose to sell that house in 2 years and rent. Let's just say you're going to rent. If you sold $1 million house and you're just going to rent for the rest of your life, what you would do with the household balance sheet is now we would have this inflow in a couple of years when you sold the house of $1 million, so less taxes. That would be listed under your financial capital. So that would happen on the left side of the column for the household balance sheet. And then on the right side, we would have to introduce a new cash flow, which would be the inflation adjusted rent that we're assuming you're going to pay for the rest of your life. So they would offset that way. So this household balance sheet is very different than a net worth statement, which is helpful. I keep a net worth statement every month, but for a retirement planning and cash flow planning, the household balance sheet, I think, incorporates a lot of the concepts that you're talking about in a much more concise, elegant way. So hopefully that helps clarify it. And thanks for pointing that out, Ron. So our next question comes from Jamie in relation to an advisor, compensation, and their 401k. So Jamie says, my wife and I are about 4 years out from retirement from a Fortune 100 company with a great 401k plan. The investment options are varied and very low cost. We have been working with an advisor from, I won't mention the firm, for about 10 years. We like him a lot, and in general, the service and advice he's provided have been good and mostly match my self-directed thoughts. Here's the kicker. Other than a whole life policy which meets an insurance desire my wife had, we don't have any products with him. He said that he is in it for the long game when we retire and transfer our low 7-figure balance to him for management. However, I'm not sure I see any advantage to taking money out of our 401k and paying higher fees. I'll need to leave some of it in regardless to take advantage of the rule of 55 for the first 4.5 years. I'd like to offer to compensate him hourly or in some other way, as I do appreciate his service, but I don't want to make a decision driven by his desire to have assets under management. Is this something reasonable? What blind spots do I have about remaining invested within the 401k? Are there other advisor types that I should be considering? Thanks so much. I've learned a tremendous amount from your show. It's great to hear Nicole back on episodes again. My word for the year, Jamie says, is move. I like move. Move's a good word. Action word. You bring up a great point, Jamie, and I've navigated this in my history as an advisor many times. No, I think you're right. I think you're right in how you're thinking here. And Andy Panko and I have had conversations on this a lot in terms of compensation models with advisors. And I know his opinions, I have evolving opinions, have had a lot of iterations of my own career, which I have to manage and think about. But I think your core question is spot on, Jamie. You have an advisor, you like having that thinking partner with you, but it sounds like, and I saw the name of the firm, that their model, it looks like, based on the product that you own and the name of the company, that it is more of a commission-based model or a asset under management model or a combination of those two things. Because he was likely compensated for the whole life policy that you were sold. If you move assets under management, she may charge a fee to manage those assets. And you're like, hey, I got these investment options. They're pretty low cost. They're good options. Isn't this enough? I think that's a really important point. What is the use case for moving these assets other than compensating you via the AUM fee? There has to be a case for that. And from an advisor standpoint, a lot of advisors are caught in the middle of what they've known and what their firms allow. So if you offer to pay them an hourly fee or a retainer fee, they may not be able to do that just because of the structural nature of their business or how they have their business structured within whichever company they're in. But at the end of the day, that's not your problem, right? It should be as transparent as it can be of this is what the advisor or the planner is doing for me, and this is the fee that I'm paying. And on your end as the consumer, it should be, this is worth it to me for now. Just like, and I do believe this, on the advisor's end, this is the services that I'm providing, and this is what I'm being compensated. It's worth my time for now. That is a win-win. So on your end, you have to decide whether the fees fit what you're receiving or perceived value, and the advisor in their business has to do the same thing. They have to decide, is this client worth working with relative to the compensation? It's a good transaction if both parties are thinking that way. Outside of all the personal stuff, which is important, but it's a business transaction, right? And so although you may like the advisor, they may not specialize in true retirement planning that's agnostic of fees and not so much about investment management as it should be about all the stuff that we talk about on the show, which is what I believe it should be. Investment management is important, but it is part of a balance sheet. It's not the balance sheet. And most advisors and planners have as the hub of everything investments and investment management. Even if they're flat fee, they have that paradigm. They don't think in a holistic way. It's how they've been trained. There's a whole discussion. We can have a whole discussion about that, but that doesn't matter to you because you and your wife want to retire and you want someone to be your decision-making partner on all sorts of things. And someone that can be compensated even if the advice is, yes, you should leave it in the 401k. Because one, you got the rule of 55 you want to do. And two, maybe they have great investment options. Why mess with something that's good? There are a lot of advantages in keeping it in a 401k. And there are reasons not to. You can evaluate that together with them that is separate from how they're compensated. So as an example, in my practice, the majority of my business is based off of asset under management, which is the traditional structure. But also I have a decent portion where I am paid a flat fee on an annual basis. We don't really care where the assets are. I'm simply their project manager and decision-making partner and guide in making all sorts of decisions in terms of non-financial stuff and tax stuff and all sorts of things. And I'm set my annual retainer based on the scope of work that we feel we do and the responsibility we have to make it worth a good business transaction on my end. And then I try to communicate that to, say, a client, improve my worth to them so we can continue to renew or have the conversation that, hey, this doesn't make sense for either party and that's okay. You can part ways. So to your question, there are advisors that do hourly planning. There are advisors that charge a retainer basis. Andy Panko has a list of, I believe, younger advisors that all do flat fee retainer planning and that are fee only that you could check out. I don't know any of them, but I like Andy, so I trust his judgment. Andy Panko does that, but he's full up and he requires that he manages the assets, even if that's not his compensation structure. So there are flat fee planners retainer-wise, and there are hourly planners. So yes, there are those options. So I think your mission would be, if that's what you want, I'm sure when your advisor now says he's in it for the long run, that's true. I think he probably is, but he may be confined by a lot of the things that I outlined. So now you have to decide, how do I approach him, or do I go searching for an advisor? And then what's my criteria to find an advisor, not just that has a compensation model that fits your situation, but also has the skill and the organization to execute some of the things I've been talking about. So hopefully that helps give you some guidance there, Jamie, and no doubt you're going to rock retirement. And I wish you the best of luck. All right. Well, I want to welcome on Kevin Lyles, coach in the Rock Retirement Club. Kevin, how you doing today?
Doing well, Roger. It's a rainy day in Columbus, Ohio.
No pickleball today.
No pickleball today.
So we've been talking about functional health with Dr. Bobby DuBois, and the response has been tremendous. It's a really important topic. I'm standing here on one leg, like you recommended in...
Working on your balance.
I'm going to try to do this for the whole time I talk to you. No, I won't. But what are your thoughts on functional health?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about an aspect of it that I find fascinating now. I read an article. I can't tell you who put this article out because it would give away the answer. But Roger, do you know what retirees' biggest fear is? You've been a financial planner for 25 plus years. What's their biggest fear?
The advisor in me would be running out of money, but I think it's going to have more to do with being healthy and active.
Yeah, it's Alzheimer's disease. And this was put out by the Alzheimer's Association. But that's a boogeyman as you age. That's like the boogeyman in the closet that you don't know if they're going to come out and get you. Yeah, there are currently more than 6 million Americans living with Alzheimer's, according to this article, which has increased over 145% over the last decade. So it's growing, maybe because we're better able to detect and diagnose it. I don't know. But, the other part of it, Roger, which I found fascinating in the article, is that over 11 million people, Americans, provide unpaid care to those Alzheimer's patients. So 6 million with Alzheimer's, 11 million providing care. So it really is affecting a lot of retirements.
I think actually the majority of care for people that need care is family and friends. I wonder, Kevin, if part of this boogeyman being so prevalent in our minds is because we're walking the journey with our parents, or we're seeing other people's parents, in-laws.
Yeah, that's when a lot of us start taking it seriously. We see mom and dad starting to fail and have to help them. And then we start projecting, right, for ourselves and our spouses and loved ones. How are we going to end up? Look, I know you say this a lot with respect to a lot of issues. If it leads to better communication, it's probably a good thing. We need to have these conversations in our families.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd say it was a good thing, but it's one of the good things that comes from it, right?
Good point. That's a good correction. So I've been reading a new book called The Expectation Effect: How Your Mindset Can Change Your World. It's by a guy in London called David Robson. And he asked 4 questions that I would like for you and your listeners to answer today. So listeners, you've got to come up with your own answer here, but I'll let Roger be the guinea pig. Number 1, do you think things get better, worse, or stay the same as you get older?
Better.
I love that. Good for you, Roger. Okay. In each pair, which of the following words do you associate with retirement and beyond? Uninvolved or involved?
Involved.
Dependent or independent?
Independent.
Unable or able?
Able.
Idle or busy?
Busy.
Okay, this is one that I just asked among my family this week. We had a really interesting conversation on this one at the Sunday dinner table. When does middle age end and old age begin? Give me a number.
70? 70?
Okay. He says now when he's in his 50s. We'll see. We'll ask again in 10 years. And then finally, based purely on your subjective experience rather than your age, how old do you feel today?
43.
Good for you. Well, Roger, you are going to live a nice long life because that's what the answers to this question tell us about your mindset, about aging and retirement and health. And people who believed that old age began at 60 or younger were 40% more likely to develop coronary artery disease than people who said 70 or older. So your heart's going to be great. But I just thought a fascinating quiz. And when we take it, it really opens up our mind to our own mindset, which I found good.
That's really interesting because as I'm answering these, it is how I feel. But in my mind, I'm like, I'm not Pollyannish. I'm not denying that I'm going to get slapped around and I'm not going to be as able to do certain things. So as I was answering them with the one-word answers that you were requesting, it felt like, oh, this seems sort of Pollyannish because I recognize that stuff is going to happen. Maybe we should have him on to do this. Dan Miller, who's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
48 Days to the Work You Love. I would love to hear his answers to this question because he is 74.
Right.
And in many ways, he is my rabbit because I bet he would answer the questions in a similar fashion that I did because he is one of the most alive men I know.
Yes. I agree with you. And I think he would. It would be fascinating to hear him tell us when old age begins.
Wouldn't it? I know he did an exercise once and I think this was through Strategic Coach, a Dan Sullivan program of forecasting living to 130 or something like that. And just to expand your horizons, whether it's actually feasible or not.
I'm sure on those word pairs, you've dealt with a number of clients over the years who wouldn't answer those word pairs the same way you did, though.
I can think of 2 or 3 right now that would be the exact opposite. And having walked life with them, I can think of the quality of their lives and how much more it could be.
Yeah. If you're going into retirement at age 65 and you already think of yourself as old in old age, it doesn't give you a lot of room for growth, does it? So that's why our mindset's important. And there are a lot of age stereotypes. I will tell you that our family conversation, my daughter-in-law was the youngest. She thought old age starts at 50.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So we quickly kicked her out of the family. But it was 60 to 70 was most people. But it really does get at how do we develop a good mindset? Because the research that David Robson points out in this book really shows a huge effect. One of the chapters in the book, Roger, I heard you talking the other day with Bobby on the podcast about the drug effects and the placebo effect. Well, in this chapter in the book, he also pointed out the nocebo effect. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
The nocebo effect is when they do these clinical trials and you have a group that's given the drug they're testing and a group that's given a sugar pill. Well, even the sugar pill group will experience the side effects that they've been warned about from the drug. So not only do they show the positive effects of the drug, taking the placebo, but the nocebo, they have, maybe it's diarrhea or aches and pains or whatever they've been told are some of the negative effects of the drug. They actually experience that. It's one of the problems we get with informed consent for these trials is we know a certain percentage of people are going to experience adverse side effects.
I guess that's no different than when Shauna tells me she feels like she has the flu. Like a half hour later, I start feeling a little, I wonder if I'm feeling bad too.
Our minds are really powerful for our health. I think the best way to ward off all of this, other than trying to have a positive mindset, is curiosity. To me, that's the most important aspect of retirement for people. Are you curious in your core pursuits? Are you doing things that will challenge you, that will teach you new things? Are you curious in your hobbies and your leisure activities about the people you come into contact with and can learn from? And even in your self-life, are you doing lifelong education? Are you reading challenging books? I think if you can remain curious throughout life, your mindset will fall in line and you'll give yourself the best chance at health and wellness.
Yeah, like Dan Miller, I was thinking about this because he's 74. He used to be in BMX bike racing.
Wow.
Right? And that was part of his identity. His boys did it. And he's 74. He doesn't do that. So the fact that he can't do what his passion was doesn't make his passion any less at 74. He just has different passions. He's into antique cars and other pursuits. It's just changing the passions.
Got to continue to grow.
And this is one of the reasons why, and we're about to bring it out within the club. I licensed it, a heroic app for club members to start using. Because literally, this is my experience. I don't think you have it yet, Kevin, but I reaffirm my identities in 3 domains every day. My love identity, my work identity, and my energy identity. So I reaffirm those identities and then I commit to certain targets in each one of those identities, right? So like a good example would be in my love identity, one of the targets I have that I have to complete by the end of the day is dominating the dishes. But it's a way of operationalizing this positive, what can I do next mindset, which is sort of that curiosity, right? What can't I do, but what can I do next?
I love it. And I know there's a lot of excitement in the club among the members to get that. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, we're all going to be heroic.
You know, I like to try new things all the time, as you know. I usually tell you about all the different devices and things I go try out.
So functional health-wise, we're going a little long, but I think it's a good discussion because I'm wearing my Whoop, which is a tracker. And I think you've tried that and you're wearing something different, I believe, unless you've switched.
Yes, I have. I did try the Whoop and I really like the Whoop. I just didn't like another strap on my wrist or on my arm. So I went with the Oura Ring. The Oura Ring recently updated to where it has basically all the same sensors as the Whoop strap does. And I also keep an Apple Watch, which tracks workouts and things like that. So I've tried just about everything. I find it a fascinating part of retirement to explore. For a month, I did the levels blood glucose monitoring. So every time I ate, I could see how my insulin levels rose or didn't rise.
And so what we're talking about with straps in Oura Rings and Whoops, by the way, is these are like your Apple Watch where they're going to track a lot of data on your resting heart rate, your heart rate variability, your blood oxygen level, how you sleep, the strain that you put your body under. So Apple Watch does a lot of this, but Oura Rings or Whoops do it in a different fashion. There's a lot that's inaccurate about it, I think, Kevin, right?
Sure.
It's not 100%. One thing that I've gotten a lot of help, where it's helped me, Kevin, most, I think, is I'm trying to make sleep a priority. Because if you want to say have 8 to 9, sleep is one of those really important things for, well, they say it helps with Alzheimer's, it helps with all sorts of things physiologically and mentally. And most of us don't get enough sleep. And it helps track my REM sleep, my deep sleep, how many disturbances, and it gives me a score. And I find that gamification helpful to try to make sure I'm getting the right amount of sleep.
Yes, I look at my sleep numbers every morning when I wake up, and it's pretty easy to tell what works and what doesn't work. You know, if you eat late at night, your sleep scores are bad. If you drink alcohol shortly before bed, your numbers are bad. Darkness in the room, the temperature in the room. I've really enjoyed playing around with those variables to see what makes me sleep the best.
I think the book study we did on, what was the book study we did on the book of?
Younger Next Year?
Thank you. It talks about this identity of all these matrix can help replace the job. This is your new job, is to be healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It is clearly one of my core pursuits now in retirement. And I spend time learning about it. One new test I'm looking at now, and I'd love it if you could ask Bobby. So if I can put in a listener question, there is a new blood test out now called the Galleri, Galleri, Galleri Cancer Detection Test. And it detects over 50 kinds of cancer. And the reason I'm interested in it is I read that 70% of cancer deaths are for cancers for which we have no screening tests. You know, we get screened for PSA tests,
right,
mammography. We have some cancers that we get screened for regularly, but most of the cancers and 70% of the deaths are attributable to cancers for which we have no screening. And this new blood test, the Gallery blood test, cancer blood test, can detect those in very early stages. So I'm thinking about trying that. So I asked Bobby if he's heard of that and has an opinion on it.
This will probably air after the series, but we're going to have a live meetup in the club about it. So maybe we can share that with the podcast audience once he answers that. Well, awesome. You look marvelous. So obviously all this work you're doing is helping out.
Thank you.
And we will chat again on the show next week or next month.
Great.
All right, buddy. All right, with that, let's go get to a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to a little baby step we can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. In the next 7 days, I want you to sit down with a pad of paper and make a list or brainstorm a couple steps you can take to start integrating some of these functional health concepts that Bobby has so graciously laid out for us these past 4 weeks. So you can start to integrate that into your life so you can make sure you can play with the grandkid or pick up the groceries or age with vigor. All right. I am off to play a midweek round of golf with my wife. Excited about that. We've got beautiful spring weather here. I hope you're off to do something pretty cool today. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize it's helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.